Okay, well, Bob, this has been kind of an ordeal getting started, but thank you for hanging in there with us. And we're excited to interact with you this morning and learn from you. And to kind of get started and to give the viewers a little context. So you and I have known each other for a long time, about 9 years. I've had the pleasure to watch you and to observe you and to see your progress. And of course, we did an organizational health index for your original employer and placed you as CEO. And it's just been a really fantastic journey to see you in action. So would you mind starting by telling the viewers a little bit about your background and your experience and kind of how you've gotten where you are?
Sure, be glad to give you a couple minutes here. So I started my first job as a CEO probably back in 1997. So I think if you do the math, that's a little over 25 years of running organizations. And I think I've run every kind of business imaginable except venture capital. So I've been everything from running Fortune 500 companies all the way down to barely solvent single proprietorship businesses with 50 people working there. So it's been a mix. Most of it has been, I'd say, more in the B2B sector, a lot of infrastructure related products and services, everything from construction to telecommunication to secure government services, engineering services, temporary bridging and road products, rental platforms, a lot of different things. So from an education standpoint, I've got a bachelor's degree in economics, and I've also got an MBA from Johns Hopkins. And I would say, I'm kind of an all-around generalist, but probably my areas where I've gathered the most experience, I would say, are probably like in marketing, business development, finance, strategy, M&A, and then, business systems and processes.
Excellent. Thanks for that context. So to kind of go back to summer 2014, early 2015, we knew that, with your company that, they had significant cultural issues, that they were great engineers, they were doing great work, but they really didn't have a sense for leadership and systems and culture. So I know that you are a big proponent of company culture and believe that, the old adage, strategy or culture eats strategy for breakfast. Has it always been the case, or how has this evolved for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you had asked me about culture, say 20 years ago, I probably would have said something to you along the lines that I know culture is important. It's something that businesses need to pay attention to, but I think I probably would have taken an attitude that it was just sort of hard to really define what you really meant by that. You couldn't really measure it. In my mind, I was kind of a very analytical type person. So, if it's one of these squishier concepts, I mean, I'd pay attention to it, but I probably didn't know what to do with it. I probably didn't know how powerful it could really be at that point in time. And, I really I wouldn't say I was against culture, but I just wasn't really quite sure what to do with it. But that really changed, I would say, probably about 15 years ago. I had kind of what I call kind of a road to Damascus experience on culture that really just changed the way I really thought about it. And I always used to describe myself as a culture convert, and there's just nothing quite as bad as dealing with a convert to something. They're much more zealous about things than people that maybe come to it more naturally. But yeah. So the big shift for me was when I was running an American subsidiary for an international firm headquartered out of the UK, and we had offices literally coast to coast. And I was on a flight from Atlanta on Southwest, and I experienced something I'd never seen before on a Southwest flight, which was an airline attendant having a meltdown with a passenger. And Travel can always be stressful and people get, excited about things that are disruptive. But for whatever reason, I don't know how many thousands of Southwest flights I'd been on over my career, but 20 years of flying with them at that time, a lot of flights. And I just had never seen a Southwest employee lose it. And so I got thinking about this. When I got off the plane, this was about the time that Southwest had just gone through a merger with AirTran, the old AirTran Airlines.
Yep.
And so I was thinking about it, and I thought, I wonder if this is an AirTran transfer. So as I was leaving the plane, I walked up to her and I said, any chance for you come over to Southwest from AirTran? And she said, yes. How did you know? And I just said, I'm just kind of a lucky guess. I kind of walked off the plane, but it just kept staying with me. I kept thinking about the incredible consistency that Southwest employees showed. And so I sat down and I wrote a letter to the CEO of the company at that time and relayed this story. And, and I just said, it feels to me like you guys have really learned something about culture, about hiring people. And I asked him if they'd be willing to share with me what they've learned. And surprisingly, I got a really nice letter back from him, and he said, bring your team and come on down.
Was that Herb Kelleher at the time?
No, Herb was already gone. I want to say
Gary
Kelly, I think maybe.
Yeah.
So I took my senior team. We went down. We spent a day in Dallas with the Southwest team. And again, just to kind of give you some perspective on sort of where my mindset was on culture, the first executive came in, I think her title was Senior Vice President of Culture. And Rob, to tell you the truth, I almost busted out laughing because I sat there, I was thinking to myself, this is a job? But that was really more a statement of just kind of my own ignorance than really anything that she was doing. But as we went through the day, I began to realize that culture could really not only be something you could measure, it's something you could use effectively as a business strategy and really differentiate yourself in a very powerful way. But I learned a lot, but not what I thought I was going to learn. I thought Southwest was going to tell me, oh, we've got these, terrific screening tools that we use for evaluating people. We've got tests that we're giving them, and really they don't do any of that. I mean, they probably one of the key lessons I learned in there was they hire for culture is what they do. Mm-hmm. They will not compromise when it comes to hiring somebody. So I remember one of their comments was, it's easier for us to teach an employee how to do their job than it is to teach them how to become a Southwest type of person. Yep. And that really stuck with me through that process. The other takeaway I think I came out of that. I'm sorry?
Was that the biggest surprise then when you met the Southwest team?
Well, it was just kind of like cascading surprises is kind of what happened. I mean, because I thought, well, as I was processing what was going on there, I thought, well, okay, maybe you just spin up a bunch of programs and processes and that kind of creates a culture for you, for your company. And, it was interesting because, and I asked Southwest about that, and they had an answer that, again, really stuck with me, which was they said, we don't think our programs and processes actually create our culture. We have to do that sort of organically. But what happens is we do have programs and processes that are in place, but they're just a natural outcome of the culture. So what they were saying was the programs don't create the culture, but the comment was, we have these programs because it would be unnatural for us not to have them. So what they do is they create an environment where I think really any employee can really come up with an idea for a program or a process. And as long as it sort of fits the profile of the Southwest culture, I mean, they're going to do it because it's just kind of a natural extension of who they are as human beings. And so that really resonated with me. And I realized I was thinking about culture all wrong. I was thinking about it as something you can program and you're going to get a result that, there's cause and effect. The program will cause an outcome of culture. And they realize, no, it's the other way around. You have to establish a culture first, and then programs and processes will happen, as a result of this. And frankly, I'm not the only one I think that got that wrong. I think a lot of business people get that wrong. There was I don't know if you remember an attempt by United to replicate Southwest. They were going to
Oh,
create
yeah.
a competing airline brand, and I think they called it TED, the last three letters of United. But what they thought was, well, it's a program. I'll program this airline. We'll use the same kind of planes that Southwest uses. We'll do the routing the same way that they do. We'll board people the same way. I'll put them in uniforms. We'll teach them some corny jokes to tell people, and they thought they could just recreate Southwest with a separate branding effort. And of course, it failed after a few years miserably, because I think what really happened was they had the same kind of bad attitude employees on the main airline that were in the TED airline. And, it just didn't take. People just, it didn't feel authentic. It wasn't really who they were as people. And so there were all these, obvious inconsistencies between the way that the people actually behaved and the way that the airline was being marketed. So,
Right.
You see these kind of mistakes all the time. People think they can easily duplicate or replicate something just by programming it. And what you really have to do is go back to the basics of who are we as people? What do we want to stand for as a company? Then I've got to make sure that my current roster of people actually are aligned with that concept, because otherwise you're going to have sort of this class system where you're going to have some people in the company that have to adhere to the company culture and strategy, other people that apparently are not allowed or required to do it. So there's a lot of soul searching that has to be done to make that work.
Right.
And the business strategy part of it was probably the culminating aspect that really cinched the deal for me, because up until that point in time, I would say that I was kind of a devotee of Michael Porter from Harvard. He's a great author, written a lot of books about strategy. And Porter always talked about, you either follow a cost leadership strategy model or you follow differentiation. And most of the businesses that I operated, differentiation was really the only viable category of business strategy, because you're technical labor selling businesses, and your labor is your number one cost component. So it's hard to go out and attract high quality people and then pay substandard wages. So it never made sense for cost leadership.
Sure.
But the great thing about strategy, though, as a business differentiator, is that it does help you achieve what Porter always talked about, which was sustainable competitive advantage. How do you create something that somebody can't replicate? And, I think the Southwest illustration, I think, really shows what happens when somebody tried to replicate it. It didn't go well. Why? Because the cultural attributes were not shared at the top of the house at United. Those people didn't believe in the cultural strategy that what Southwest was trying to do. So therefore, anybody they empowered to do that, was still beholden to the people that were making the decisions at United, and there just wasn't a good fit there. So what I realized there was culture could become a perfectly differentiated strategy that my competitors, even if they knew everything I was doing, they were not going to be able to replicate it, because the people that were running the companies I was competing with did not possess the same cultural identity and priority of what we did. And so, when you start making those kind of changes, if you're really serious about changing your company culture, there's going to be some casualties. I mean, you're going to have some people that are going to have to depart the company because, frankly, they're just not bought into what you're talking about.
Right.
And, I always felt like, that's a tough call for an existing CEO of a company. He's got to take a hard look at himself or herself. They got to take a hard look at the senior team. And, a bunch of those people may not survive. And so to me, what I used to tell my employees was, the reason I'm not worried about our competition knowing what we're doing is because the first person the competition would have to fire would be their own CEO. And typically they're not willing to do that.
Yeah.
But certainly it'd be a lot easier if you brought somebody in from outside the company to do that. And that was kind of the opportunity that happened with the engineering firm you were talking about when I was recruited by your company. They recognized they needed something different. They wanted a different kind of leader. They wanted a different kind of model, something that was scalable. I don't know at that time they knew they needed a different culture, but I think one of the first reports I gave to the board of directors when I started that assignment was I went around and talked to a bunch of people in the company, and I had identified at least 3 or 4 active cultures that were functioning in the business at that time. And that was kind of the result of, they had done some acquisitions, hadn't really done a whole lot to really try to integrate these businesses. And so as a result, you had a lot of these legacy cultures that were functioning throughout the business.
Right.
But it was a little bit of, I guess to use the word culture shock, I think, for that firm when I came in and started taking them through the process of reevaluating our culture and deciding what we were going to be when we were done.
Right.
And that was tough for a lot of people to have to kind of go back to square one.
Yeah. So I got a couple of clarifying questions. So I remember back in those days, we were conducting one-on-one interviews with, a lot of the senior leadership team before we actually started the search at the engineering firm. And one of the questions that came up was, does the new CEO have to be an engineer? And the knee-jerk reaction was, well, of course they have to be an engineer. It's an engineering company. And then there were a number of the young, bright senior leaders who said, you know what? That's the last thing we need. What we need is somebody. We need a leader. We need somebody who can show us what culture is about, because we don't know what it's about. We don't know what good leadership looks like. We don't know what systems look like. We don't know how to measure things that need to be measured. And so, the things you're talking about, we're interested in. We just don't really know how to do it. So that kind of set the stage for, who and what we were looking for. And of course, we had to go all the way to, far up there in the Northeast to find you. But, we're thrilled we did that. So I want to ask you a question about some observations we're noticing right now in the business community. So there are a lot of people out there, a lot of CEOs, a lot of boards. There's a lot of pressure from outside, from other stakeholders, from shareholders to engage in ESG related activities and to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and now belonging. There are companies that are trying to become purpose driven. So they're essentially trying to do a lot of the things that you and I talk about regularly. And it seems that they're trying to do it by checking boxes, or, to use your term in the Southwest story, by implementing programs. And that seems to be failing on an epic, in an epic way. Can you comment on that? Or?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to start off and say, from a generational standpoint, there's definitely a generational aspect to what you're talking about. I came up sort of towards the back end of the baby boom generation, so that really shaped the way I thought about business life, certainly. And I think I graduated college in 1981 with my undergraduate degree, and jobs were just tough to come by at that time. I mean, we had, I think, what was known as the misery index back in those days. We had double-digit inflation, we had double-digit unemployment, and frankly, people of my generation at that time, we were just hoping somebody was dumb enough to hire us. Quite candidly. I mean, we didn't have sophisticated plans that we were looking at and long-term, career objectives. And I think that the younger generations today, the millennials, the Gen Zs, they've got a much keener understanding of what they're trying to do and where they're trying to go. And I really admire that. I think that's very healthy and very impactful. But I do think there are some differences in terms of how you position yourself in the work world. And I think that, To me, and again, obviously it's because of my age, but everything was sort of meritocracy driven. You were in a meritocracy, you had to perform. I mean, some people would say it's kind of an up or out model. In most companies, that's kind of how they operate. I mean, if you weren't performing at a high level, you're just not going to survive. You're not going to be here. You're going to be replaced by somebody, because for every person there was 10 other people that wanted your job, and that's just kind of the way it was. I mean, it was just it was produce or perish. It's kind of how it was. So that really shaped the way I thought about the world. Now, I think as an economist, I would say, in terms of what that academic training would teach you in this regard would be that you have to be productive to generate income for yourself. I mean, you look at it from a national GNP sort of standpoint, gross national product standpoint. The only way that national economies thrive is because they're more productive, and that can be through labor, it can be through technology, use of capital, et cetera. So, I think that on micro level, that's also very true, and even down to an individual level. So the harder I was willing to work, the more I was willing to apply myself, the greater the results I was going to have. So from that standpoint, if you try to put an ESG lens on top of a meritocracy, it's hard for me to sort of square that circle. I'm not sure how that really works. But I guess I would say this from a cultural standpoint. If it's really the cultural identity of your organization to really put an emphasis on ESG, then you need to be all in on that. You need to have every aspect of your business. You need to be hiring people that think that way. You need to get your processes aligned that way. You need to be measuring your outcomes that way. And then you need to market your business that way. I mean, if that's really what you think will sell, then that's what you've got to go after and go do. On the other hand, if you really look at this and say, well, I've got these pesky clients I've got to take care of, and they're demanding X, Y, and Z, and ESG is not on that list, then I think you're running a risk of muddying your brand and losing your focus and confusing your people.
Right.
So I think if you're just trying to do this to be fashionable, just to check the box, I think you're deluding yourself. And I think you're hurting your company and you're hurting your employees, and you're going to disappoint your clients.
Right.
If, on the other hand, there is a business entity or an industry you're in where this is really front and center and it is the vibrant driver of what you're doing, then I would say, by all means, jump headlong. You should absolutely do that. I'm just not sure what that would exactly look like. I'd need to kind of somebody explain that industry to me.
Right.
Because I think at the end of the day, you've got to have satisfied clients to be successful.
Right.
Big shock there. And what I would tell you is that, based on my experience, clients care about three things. I don't care what industry it's in. If you're listening to this, you should write this down, because this is absolute marketing gold. What they care about is they want a defect-free product or service. They want it delivered on time, and they want it delivered by somebody who cares. Okay, that's it. Now, what you have to do is understand, what does that lens mean for my particular business? Because, if you're running a restaurant, that's going to be different than if you're running an accounting consultancy business, right? But those are it. I mean, that's it. And so if you can figure those three things out, you can differentiate yourself in a way where you're going to be successful. And if ESG fits into that lens, by all means, I would go at it. Okay. If it doesn't, honestly, it's probably a distraction.
Yeah, got it. So you've, according to what you've told me today and in other conversations, you've gone from having an attitude of like, okay, well, culture, I'm not sure really what that is, to, hey, culture's nice, but I'm not really sure what to do with it, to being what I would consider a culture code champion. I mean, somebody who really has built fabulous cultures that engages your workforce and has, all of the measurable things that result from that. Very low turnover, very high engagement, very high customer delight, all those things. Can you give the listeners some specific examples of what you've done to drive that kind of, or to nurture that kind of culture?
Yeah, I think so. I guess before I jump into some of the examples, I'd like to put a caveat, I guess I could, on this, is that I'm not sure there's any specific formula that works for all companies. Okay. So I think, I can give you some illustrations about the kinds of things that we engaged in, but if you pursue this like you're following a recipe and expect a nice cake culture cake's going to come out of the oven at the end, I'm not sure it's going to work exactly that way. But with that warning, I'll jump in here. So
Sure.
I think the first thing, which I alluded to a little bit earlier, is you have to have a frank conversation with your senior leadership team about who we currently are and what we aspire to be in the future. And that can be, I remember, with the engineering firm you're talking about, going in there, and I think, with the senior team there was initially some groans and some muttering like, oh my gosh, do we really have to do this? And I said, yes, we do. We really have to have this debate about who it is we are and what do we aspire to be, because without that, it's just kind of me saying, okay, well, we're going to do X, we're going to do Y. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. So it needs to be broadly embraced, that, and you need to go through that process of recognition that you want every senior leader at some point to have sat there and said, I'm on record as saying, this is who I want us to be as a company. This is what I'm committing to be as a human being. Okay. And you need, as the CEO, you need that stated buy-in before you can really get going with anything else. I think what that then naturally leads to is what I'd call kind of a traditional gaps analysis. So obviously you can look at this from the standpoint of just culture, but then you've got to also think about from the standpoint of systems and processes, because the systems and processes need to reinforce and report on the cultural progress. So a gaps analysis, the way we've always done it, would be we spend some time characterizing the current state. So you can look at everything from how you're doing your marketing, how are you doing your recruiting, how your HR systems are working, how's your accounting functioning. Tell me, the current state of all your operational things, quality, how you do your pricing, and business development. You just go down the list of every area in the business, describe the current state. This is how it is today. And that can be a very enlightening conversation all in itself, because you might be amazed to find out how people see these things differently within your current organization. Like for instance, quality. When we had the discussion at the engineering firm about this, we probably had that one topic alone probably took a 4-hour conversation to get through, because people were all over the place. There was no real agreement about how good was the product we were delivering. Now, I had sort of an advantage in this conversation because I had already interviewed about 30 of our clients, and I knew what the clients thought about our quality. They told me as the new CEO. But the team didn't know that at that time. And so I was able to, really lead some pointed questions through that process. But so I think you can, as a CEO, you can learn a lot about how engage. Not only are you going to get the answers to these current state questions, but you're also going to get some sense of the level of engagement from your team. Is this something people feel passionately about? Do they know what's going on? Are they even, remotely connected to whatever the topic is? And so I think there's valuable information for a CEO, even if you have generally wild agreement about what the current state of affairs are. So then when you get that list together, then what you do is you go, over to the other side of the flip chart, if you will, and you write out future state. So this is now, no holds barred. What do we want to be? This is what our accounting is like today. What would we like it to be like in the future? Here's how we're doing recruiting today. What would we like that to look like in the future? You go through that process. And actually, I always found the future state is actually a less contentious discussion. Because I think people, especially in leadership, they just instinctively know what good looks like, because they've seen it somewhere. And they want that. They want to be excellent. I always said that 96% of all the employees I ever had wanted to be great employees.
Right.
You can do a lot with that as a CEO. I mean, you really can. But you got to know, where am I taking them? And without that process, you're not going to be able to get very far. So then from there, what we did was I guess I'd say, an analysis of our business model. And, business model is one of those terms where if you use it with other people, they kind of nod their head. They kind of instinctively kind of know what a business model is. But interestingly, if you ask people, define what you mean by business model, you will get some really diverse and crazy answers about that. So for purposes of our discussion here, the way I thought about business model was, it's a shorthand way of describing how the organization succeeds and fails. So if we win, we do these things well. If we fail, we struggle in these areas. So getting that firmly in your mind, and again, this needs to be shared by your entire leadership team. Everyone needs to know what it is that takes us to be successful or not to be successful. So in this case, I took people through a couple of different ways of thinking about that. One was, we just went through the financials. So I took an income statement. One of the easiest things you can look at is, where are you spending your money? All your expenses, where do you spend money? So obviously, if you're a capital intensive business, that expenditure pattern is going to look different than if you're a technical labor selling business. If you're a brokerage firm, that's going to be different. But it's going to tell you a story about where you are spending your money. And so therefore, that becomes obviously a priority in the business. Those things need to be managed well. In the business we were talking about, 80 cents out of every dollar was being spent directly on human capital, salaries, benefits, payroll taxes. The next two biggest items were IT, information technology, and facilities. Those made up another 10% of the expenditures. Now, I would argue that the only reason in a business like that to spend money on IT and facilities is to facilitate the people, right? So you could make the argument that 90 cents out of every dollar was being spent on human capital. So my point to the leadership team was, if we mismanage the process of bringing people on, of training them, of recruiting new talent, of onboarding them, whatever words you want to use, if we mismanage that process, are there enough other expenditures in the business for us to overcome those mistakes? And the answer was no.
No.
So what that did was that changed the mindset right away, that this was something everybody kind of knew was important, but if you looked inside the systems and processes, there was nothing in there that would suggest that this was important. We weren't measuring it. We weren't documenting it. I mean, it was just, there were a lot of gaps, a lot of holes. So that discussion gave kind of the leadership team renewed focus on the importance of that. Then you could go to the balance sheet. You could look at, where are our assets? Where are our liabilities? And what that really showed us was the extreme importance of cash management. Okay, most businesses, I would say that's probably the case. But in our business, it was massively important. And again, when you look at it, it's okay, well, tell me about our systems and processes for managing cash flow, for getting invoices out. Non-existent. So again, now what you're doing is, you're not necessarily, as a leader, you're not necessarily through that conversation causing new information necessarily to rise, but what you are doing is creating a new urgency around performance in those areas. They become priorities in the business, right? Then you could do a similar thing looking at other stakeholders. You could look at, what do clients say are important? What do the employees say are important, right? And to me, what I was always looking for were, if you've got a topic that uniformly rates out as important through that business model analysis, then it's a priority for the business. But some cases, you're going to come up with things where there are conflicts. So as an example of that might have been where I have clients that are demanding that the services be rendered very quickly. They want schedule being met now, yesterday, in fact. But I've got, say, me employees that really don't want to be working 80-hour weeks. They want to work closer to 40, and they don't want that kind of pressure on them. So that's a conflict. You know, you can't really square those two things up, right? So what you have to do now is realize, okay, it's a conflict, and I'm going to search for a balance. I've got to find the point where both interests are being at least somewhat satisfied, right? And so you have to go through a whole process of figuring out how you're going to implement that. So what it really comes down to is the gaps analysis and the business model will help clarify the priorities, and then the things that are overlapping inconsistencies, and then the conflicts where you're just, now as a leadership team, we have to sit down and decide where are we going to strike the balance between those two. Because when I used to do onboarding at that firm, we'd hire new engineers coming in, and I would say something like this. I would say, hey, I want you to imagine working for a company where the only thing we cared about is what the employees cared about. I mean, wouldn't that be great? I mean, you'd have a place where everything you wanted was being done, and then they'd realize, the smart ones would be like, hey, there's something coming on here, and then I'd say, okay, well, imagine if we worked at a company where all I cared about were the clients, how miserable that could make some people working there. So the point was, yeah, it might be really great to work at a really super only employee focused company for a while, but eventually I'm not going to have any clients. I won't need you, and there won't be any bonuses, and there won't be any benefits, and there won't be. So it's just kind of trying to get across the idea. I'm trying to, through that discussion, to get the employees bought into the idea that we need balance in what we're doing. It can't be just all one way or the other. It's not healthy. It's not a good culture if we do that. So that becomes part of the culture that you're talking about.
Right.
The other thing we always tried to do was keep the core value discussion simple and focused. What are the values that we hold core to us? That what I used to tell, again, onboarding employees would be, a core value is something I consider ever present. What I mean by that is there's never a time I'm going to ask you to do something that's contrary to these core values. Now, I know you've looked at a lot of companies. Most companies, if you walk into and ask just a regular employee what the core values are, they either don't know, or they have to run into a conference room and write them down because they're on a wall somewhere in there. And so what our objective was, we wanted the core values to be something simple, just a handful, and that everybody would know what they are. And so we had 5 core values that we looked at, and that were core to the business. And I would say to this day, I mean, if you walked into that office and asked any employee in there what the core values are, they know them. Plus they're totally brand new, they know the core values, and they know why they're core values. And then what we distinguished between that and that there were other things we valued, but they just weren't core. So the 2 examples I always used was, one was the area of creativity. You're providing engineering services. There's a lot of times you need to be creative. Well, what I told them is it can't be core, because when I look at my accounting department, I'm not looking for creative accounting. So, that it can't be a core value. It's situationally valued, right? Or the other thing is, I think we saw ourselves as kind of a fun organization. We like to, work hard, play hard kind of mindset. Did a lot of stuff like that. People that really built their friendships through the people they worked with, which was great. But obviously what we do is serious, and so you can't be acting like a bunch of clowns all the time. So that would be a non-core value, but it is something we care about. So that was the distinction that we tried to really make in that process. And so from that discussion, then I'd say that the couple things then you've really got to do is, as a leader, you've got to build a communications plan to be able to explain what's going on. This is where we're going. This is why we're going there. This is why our core values are this. Here's other things that aren't core values, but they're still important to us. Here's how we're going to differentiate ourselves in the market. Here's why we're changing some of our systems and processes, because they're not aligned with what our core values are. We're going to change our hiring process to make sure that we're focusing on cultural fit and not just technical competence. Here's why that's important. And I would say that if you're the type of person that feels like, I really like to tell people one time something and then I'm done telling them, I get that, but it doesn't work like that, especially not with culture. You have to tell them over and over and over. You got to tell them what you told them. You got to tell them, and then you got to tell them why you told them it. And the bottom line really is, you just can never, as a leadership team, get fatigued communicating about what's going on, because that transparency is really important to building the trust that the team, because you're asking people to make some pretty big changes, almost certainly.
Right.
And they need to trust you that your motives are good, that you're doing it for the right reasons, and that life ultimately is going to be better because we're making these changes. And then from there, I think the other mistake that I see a lot of companies make is that the CEO will delegate the onboarding process to others. It's a massive mistake, especially if you're hiring based on culture. People need to come in and understand that the CEO is bought in on this and that this is something that's really important. And they need to be able to connect the dots for the average employee of, this is why we're doing things this way as opposed to some other way, because it's better aligned with our culture. This is how it informs our decision making. Here's how it changes the way we allocate resources. Here's how it changes the way we reward people for what they do, right? And then the other thing I think you have to have is you have to be prepared to exit people from the business that don't fit. And some of these will be painful decisions. They may be some of your friends. They may be long-term, valuable employees in the company. But you can't operate the business as a true culture-facing company if you allow other people to operate outside the core values and norms of the business. You can't have two-tier process that way. I used to kind of somewhat jokingly, but it kind of got the message across, was I developed a concept through some of my companies we called our alumni program. So when we had somebody that was a misfit in the business, I mean, I was usually very patient with them to work with them on that process. And, because I realized, it took time for them to get misaligned.
Right.
But once we got to the point where it felt like they really weren't going to any longer make the effort to improve, then it was like, okay, we have this nice alumni program. We're going to move you into that, and let's talk about transition and having that adult conversation, because frankly, they're not going to be happy if they're culturally misaligned. They're not going to be happy, and you're not going to be happy. So you're just kidding yourself if you just drag it out. And so what you want to do is, it's this balance idea as a CEO. You have to sit there and say, look, I've got to give them time to make the change. But at the same time, if I'm not really seeing good faith efforts, then I'm going to have the adult conversation and talk to them about the alumni program. I mean, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So your the organization that we're talking about was a purpose-driven, or is a purpose-driven company. What are the implications of that?
Well, I mean, you have to understand is it's what I'd call a technical labor selling business. So, what you're selling kind of two things in that area. You're selling the resume of the people that are working there. So they've got credentials, they've got academic training, they've got real world job experience, they've got some kind of track record of presumably good results. So you're selling that. The other thing you're selling is availability. Okay, so it doesn't do good. I could have 1,000 great people that all have the resumes, but if none of them are available when the client needs you, you're not gonna be successful there. So what you're really, I think, trying to do there is you're trying to make sure that those people that you're bringing in are culturally aligned with what you're trying to do. And the way Southwest does it is they use they call work team hiring is what they do. So I'm going to be a baggage handler in Buffalo, New York. I'm going to get interviewed by the rest of that team that I'm going to be working with. And what they're really trying to evaluate is, can Bob be a good Southwest employee? Is he going to fit in? And if the answer is no, it doesn't matter, how strong I am or how many years I've been doing this, they're not going to hire me. Doesn't matter. And they'd rather, if I've never had any experience handling bags, they'd rather hire me if I've got the right attitude, and then they're going to teach me what I need to know. Right. So I think some version of that is what you're going to have to do if you're going to try to be a purpose-driven organization like that. You're going to have to, first of all, know yourself. What is it we value and what's important to us? But more importantly, you've got to then think about what's the best hiring process for identifying those people that fit. And I would tell you that there is a degree of trial and error. We'll put it this way, I never found a perfect formula that basically said, if this person checks these boxes, hire them. If they don't. I couldn't get there. And so, but there did get to be a point where what I did find was that if I had more senior staff involved in the recruiting effort, those people tended to be more culturally aligned. They were kind of the champions, I guess might be the word you would use in that regard. So they were the best eyes and ears I had, I think, in terms of really trying to identify people that more than likely fit the profile. But this, you've been doing recruiting a long time. I mean, there are people out there who are really skilled at interviewing. I mean, they can convince you there's something, and then you hire them and you find out, oh my gosh, this person isn't anywhere near what I thought they were. So the other thing we tried to do in there was to try to engage with people way in advance of actually having a conversation about coming to work there. So we did that through social media, and that's probably a topic for a whole nother podcast, but just, using social selling techniques, permission marketing techniques to connect with people, to develop relationships. And kind of what ends up happening is people sort of self-select themselves. If they're interacting with your company content on social media channels, well, we always said we were looking for digital hand raises, somebody that they like the content, they're interacting with it in a positive way, they're reposting it. That's an indication of interest, and so then I think you could have more detailed conversations and without the pressure of you're trying to hire somebody or fill a position, I'm just trying to get to know you. And the better you get to know the person, the greater the likelihood is you're going to be able to properly assess the cultural fit.
Yep.
Now, the problem, of course, is a lot of times you get an opening, all hell's breaking loose and I need a body in here. But that's, as a CEO, you should understand that's a danger zone. It's a coin flip. I may get them right, I may get it wrong, and you got to be recognized that's the risk of filling positions in that way.
Yep. Well, so I am just enormously grateful for having known you for as long as I have, and hopefully we'll have years and years of subsequent conversations. So you're writing a book. I'd like you to talk about that just a little bit, because I'm chomping at the bit to get my hands on that. And any final thoughts you have about culture and what we should be doing as leaders and organizations to build the kind of cultures that you've built.
Sure. Well, the book, I never really saw myself as a writer. So, I always liked writing in the context of my day-to-day running of a business, writing newsletters to employees, things like that. But so as I was approaching retirement, I kept running into people at my current company and then people from my past once they kind of heard I was getting ready to retire. And they would say something like, I just find myself reflecting on things you've told me over the years. And some of these can go back people I haven't really worked with for 20 years, but they're still telling me, I remember when we had this problem and you told us this or you told us that. And several people just said, I think there's some real leadership wisdom there that people could benefit from. And I think you really ought to think about writing a book. So I did. I just sat down and started. I thought, I don't know if it'll turn into a book. I don't know, maybe it'll just. And so what I really did was there's about, 15, 20 chapters in the book. So it's not going to be a big book, but it's really a leadership philosophy guide. And what I did was each chapter in the book is kind of a statement that anybody that worked with me over the 25 plus years of being a CEO, they almost certainly would have heard me say probably all of these things, but an example might be, one of them was, I'm not in the people fixing business. So there's a whole chapter about what do I mean by that and why, what are the leadership attributes of that? Another one might be control the narrative before the narrative controls you. Okay. So again, I'm just taking these things, and I've done is I've tried to sprinkle in some actual things that happened throughout my career, which I think, a lot of readers I think will find really interesting and probably identify with, because these are problems that if you're running a business or aspire to run a business, you're having this problem or you're going to have this problem. So that's kind of the idea of the book. And I think it's in editing, or the manuscript is done. It's in editing right now. I'm working with a consultant out of California who's going to help me get it published. And I think, probably towards the end of this year, early next year, I think it'll be out. So that's what's happening with the book.
Well, that's fantastic, and we can't wait to see it. Hopefully, we'll be one of your biggest sales outlets.
Okay.
Because I've certainly learned a great deal from you, and you've been incredibly generous with your time. And I salute what you're trying to do. To be honest, I was kind of in a. It was short, but I was kind of in a deep state of depression for a few days when I heard that you were retiring. Because the interaction has been so meaningful. So thank you so much for your time this morning. And you've opened the door to do a couple of more of these. So perhaps we'll tap you for a couple of more down the road.
Anytime, Rob. Always glad to visit with you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bob. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Have a great time.